In 1882, the entire population of Redemption Hollow, Arizona, simply vanished overnight. 37 families, gone without a trace. When territorial authorities finally investigated, they found something carved into the church's wooden communion table that made them seal all records for over a century. Tonight, we're revealing what they discovered in those underground chambers and why the Sinclair family's version of salvation involved consuming more than just bread and wine. Before we continue with the story of Redemption Hollow and the dark secrets that festered beneath its pious surface, this channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of American history that others refuse to tell. If you're one of the few who can handle these forbidden truths, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. This community is built for true seekers of hidden history, and we want to know where our fellow investigators are located. Now let's descend into the shadows of Arizona territory, where salvation came at a price no soul should ever pay. The story begins not with screams or blood, but with the quiet desperation of faithful people seeking redemption in an unforgiving land. Redemption Hollow wasn't marked on most territorial maps, and for good reason. Nestled between the Superstition Mountains and the Salt River Valley, this settlement of barely 400 souls existed in the kind of isolation that breeds either saints or devils. Founded in 1847 by Ezekiel Sinclair, a self-proclaimed Methodist preacher fleeing some unnamed scandal in Missouri, the town attracted the kind of settlers who had their own reasons for disappearing into the desert. The truth about Ezekiel's Missouri departure would have shocked his Arizona followers had they known the details carefully hidden in burned church records and unmarked graves. Reverend Ezekiel Sinclair had served the Harmony Methodist Church in Independence, Missouri for 70 years before theological differences led to his abrupt resignation. Those differences centered on his interpretation of communion, which had evolved from symbolic remembrance to something far more literal and disturbing. The final incident in Missouri occurred during the harsh winter of 1846, when several members of Ezekiel's congregation went missing during a prolonged blizzard. When their bodies were discovered the following spring, the local sheriff noted unusual markings consistent with deliberate butchery rather than animal predation. Ezekiel's explanation that desperate circumstances had forced faithful Christians to make unthinkable choices for survival satisfied neither civil authorities nor church leadership. His departure for Arizona territory preceded formal charges by mere weeks. The Sinclair family compound dominated Redemption Hollow like a fortress of faith. Built from red sandstone quarried from nearby cliffs, the main church could hold the entire population, while the adjacent family residence sprawled across 3 acres, connected to the church by underground tunnels that Ezekiel claimed were necessary for private spiritual counseling. What the townspeople didn't know was that these tunnels led to chambers carved with meticulous care into the desert bedrock, creating a labyrinth designed for purposes that would make Spanish Inquisition dungeons seem merciful. The construction of these underground facilities began during Redemption Hollow's first winter, when Ezekiel convinced his followers that protection from Apache raids required reinforced shelters beneath the church. Working in shifts to maintain secrecy, teams of men excavated tons of rock and sand, creating chambers connected by narrow passages that could be sealed from the inside. The official purpose was community defense. The actual design facilitated imprisonment, torture, and disposal of human remains with industrial efficiency. Ezekiel's wife, Miriam, bore him 7 children, but it was their eldest son, Jeremiah, who inherited both his father's magnetic presence and his hunger for absolute control. Even as a child, Jeremiah displayed an unsettling combination of intelligence and cruelty, organizing elaborate games among the settlement's children that invariably ended with someone being punished for imaginary transgressions. By adolescence, he'd begun assisting his father with special counseling sessions in the underground chambers, showing an intuitive understanding of psychological manipulation that impressed even Ezekiel. By 1855, when Ezekiel died under mysterious circumstances, some said poison, others claimed divine judgment, Jeremiah had already established himself as the settlement's spiritual and temporal leader. At 26, he possessed the kind of dark charisma that could make murder sound like mercy, backed by an organizational mind that transformed his father's sporadic violence into systematic elimination of threats to Sinclair authority. The population of Redemption Hollow consisted primarily of failed prospectors, widowed homesteaders, and religious refugees from various Eastern denominations. They came seeking gold or God, often settling for survival. The Apache raids of the 1850s had left many families broken, desperate for protection that only the Sinclairs seemed capable of providing. What they received instead was subjugation disguised as salvation, enforced through a combination of economic dependence and carefully orchestrated terror. Jeremiah's interpretation of Methodist doctrine bore little resemblance to Wesley's teachings. He preached that sin was a physical contamination that could only be purged through increasingly extreme acts of penance. Minor transgressions required public confession and fasting. More serious sins demanded isolation in the purification chambers beneath the church. But for those guilty of what Jeremiah deemed abominations against the divine order, only complete spiritual cleansing could save their souls, and the souls of the entire community. The town's economy depended entirely on the Sinclair family's mysterious wealth. They owned the general store, the grain mill, and the only well that never ran dry, even during the worst droughts. Jeremiah claimed this prosperity was proof of divine favor, but the source of their capital remained carefully hidden. Property deeds and business records showed a pattern of acquisitions that coincided precisely with the disappearances of previous owners, suggesting that murder had been profitable as well as spiritually satisfying for the Sinclair family. October 13th, 1858, a date that would forever divide Redemption Hollow's history into before and after. Thomas Crawford, a traveling merchant from Tucson, arrived with a wagon full of supplies and questions that should have remained unasked. Crawford had been trading throughout the territory for 15 years, and he possessed the kind of practical skepticism that comes from seeing humanity at its worst. He noticed things others missed, and what he noticed in Redemption Hollow filled him with unease. Crawford's practiced eye immediately detected the subtle signs of a community living under systematic oppression. The settlement seemed prosperous enough, but he observed children who flinched when adults spoke too loudly, women who hurried past the church with downcast eyes, and men whose conversations ceased abruptly whenever strangers approached. Most disturbing were the families he'd traded with the previous year, who were nowhere to be found, their homes occupied by nervous newcomers who claimed the previous residents had moved on to better opportunities. The merchant's first mistake was asking direct questions about these missing families. When he inquired about the Pattersons, who'd purchased significant quantities of farming supplies just 6 months earlier, he was told they'd received urgent word of inheritance opportunities in California and departed immediately. The explanation satisfied most listeners, but Crawford noticed that the Patterson children's belongings remained in their former home, including a beloved doll that no 6-year-old girl would abandon willingly. Crawford's second mistake was expressing skepticism about Jeremiah's increasingly elaborate sermons regarding divine judgment and purification. During his 2-day stay, he attended Sunday service and witnessed the preacher deliver a theological discourse that transformed Christian doctrine into something unrecognizable. Jeremiah spoke of communion as literal consumption of sin, of purification through fire and blade, and of the chosen few who were called to cleanse the world through sacred consumption. The Lord commands us to be fishers of men, Jeremiah proclaimed from his pulpit, his voice carrying the hypnotic cadence that held his congregation spellbound. But fishing requires proper preparation of the catch. The contaminated flesh must be purged of sin before it can nourish the righteous. Those who resist this purification endanger not only their own souls, but the spiritual welfare of our entire community. Crawford's final mistake was discovering the narrow cellar door hidden behind the church's altar during an evening when he'd sought shelter from a sudden sandstorm. The merchant had intended merely to wait out the weather in the church vestibule, but his curiosity was aroused by sounds echoing from beneath the building, sounds that resembled human voices raised in distress rather than prayer. What Crawford found in that underground chamber would haunt his final hours and create the first documented evidence of the Sinclair's true nature. The room was carved directly from the bedrock, its walls lined with iron shackles and peculiar drainage channels that led to a central depression. The floor bore stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove, and the air reeked of something far worse than death. It carried the stench of deliberate desecration, of human dignity systematically destroyed through ritualized torture. The chamber contained implements that belonged in no Christian facility, restraining devices designed to hold struggling victims, cutting tools arranged with surgical precision, and collection vessels positioned to capture fluids from suspended bodies. Carved into the stone walls were biblical verses, but twisted to justify unspeakable acts. Take, eat, this is my body, and he that eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood dwelleth in me. But it was the wooden table at the chamber's center that revealed the full horror of Redemption Hollow's secret. Carved into its surface were 31 names, each accompanied by a date and a single word: cleansed. The most recent entry, dated just 2 weeks prior, belonged to the Patterson family. All 4 members, including their 6-year-old daughter Sarah, whose doll still sat on her former bedroom windowsill. Crawford's discovery lasted perhaps 10 minutes before Jeremiah's voice echoed through the chamber like thunder from a vengeful God. "Brother Crawford, you seem to have lost your way." The preacher emerged from the shadows with 3 other men, Marcus Samuel and church deacon William Hayes, their faces bearing the kind of calm that accompanies absolute certainty. "But perhaps this is divine providence. Perhaps your soul too requires cleansing." The merchant tried to flee, but the underground passages formed a maze designed to prevent escape. His captors pursued him through tunnels that connected to chambers even more horrifying than the first, including preparation rooms where human remains were processed with the same care other communities applied to livestock slaughter. Crawford's screams echoed through the labyrinth as he realized the true purpose of Redemption Hollow's prosperity. The Sinclairs had created an efficient system for murdering travelers and transforming their deaths into both spiritual justification and economic profit. The merchant's screams echoed through the tunnels for 3 days and nights. Though the townspeople were told, he suffered from desert fever and required intensive spiritual healing. Those brave enough to pass near the church during those October nights reported hearing sounds that no human throat should make, punctuated by Jeremiah's voice reading scripture in languages that predated Christianity, mixed with what sounded like surgical procedures conducted without anesthesia. On the 4th morning, Jeremiah announced that Brother Crawford had achieved complete spiritual purification and departed for California, carrying letters of introduction to fellow believers. His wagon and horses were seen leaving town just after dawn, driven by a figure bundled against the morning chill. But Sarah Mackenzie, whose insomnia had her watching from her kitchen window, swore the driver's movements seemed wrong somehow. Too stiff, too deliberate, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Crawford's departure marked the beginning of a new phase in Redemption Hollow's descent into darkness. What had been occasional disappearances became a monthly ritual, timed with the lunar cycle and justified by increasingly elaborate theological explanations that turned murder into sacrament and cannibalism into communion with the divine. Years following Crawford's spiritual departure saw Redemption Hollow transform from a struggling frontier settlement into something that existed beyond the reach of territorial law or Christian conscience. Jeremiah's power grew with each missing soul, his sermons evolving into mesmerizing displays of theological manipulation that convinced his followers they were participants in divine justice rather than witnesses to systematic murder. The Sinclair family expanded their influence through carefully orchestrated marriages and strategic adoptions. Jeremiah took 3 wives in succession, each meeting mysterious ends after bearing him children who inherited his magnetic presence and moral flexibility. His siblings, Marcus, Ruth, Rebecca, and young Samuel, formed an inner circle of absolute loyalty, each managing different aspects of what outsiders might call a criminal enterprise, but they considered sacred duty. Marcus, the eldest brother at 34, oversaw the trials that determined which settlers required spiritual cleansing. These proceedings took place in the main church during new moon nights, when darkness concealed the participants' faces and muffled their voices. The accused, always newcomers or those who questioned established authority, faced charges, ranging from adultery and theft to the more nebulous crimes of spiritual contamination and divine rebellion. The trials followed a perverse parody of legal procedure that gave legitimacy to predetermined conclusions. Marcus served as prosecutor, presenting evidence that was invariably fabricated but delivered with the conviction of absolute truth. Witnesses testified to sins they claimed to have observed, usually in dreams or visions that revealed the accused's hidden corruption. The jury consisted of church members whose own survival depended on their willingness to condemn others, creating a system where mercy was literally a death sentence for those who showed it. Ruth, now 28 and possessed of an accountant's mind for detail, managed the practical aspects of disappearances. She ensured that missing persons had believable cover stories, that their possessions were redistributed in ways that strengthened community dependence on Sinclair generosity, and that any documentation of their existence was systematically destroyed. Ruth maintained ledgers tracking each cleansing with the same precision other women applied to household budgets, recording not only names and dates but also the practical yield from each victim's property and personal effects. Her records revealed the industrial efficiency of the Sinclair operation. Each disappearance was preceded by weeks of careful observation to determine the victim's social connections, financial resources, and potential for resistance. Families with children were targeted during school periods when the young ones could be easily controlled. Single adults were preferred during winter months when travel explanations seemed most plausible. Even the timing of departures was calculated to coincide with stagecoach schedules and seasonal migration patterns. Rebecca, the youngest daughter at 25, served as the family's spiritual interpreter, crafting theological justifications for increasingly extreme acts. She claimed to receive divine visions that revealed the hidden sins of community members and the specific purification rituals required for their salvation. Her prophecies always seemed to target those who possessed valuable property or posed potential threats to Sinclair authority, but her delivery was so compelling that even skeptics found themselves questioning their doubts. Rebecca's theological innovations transformed cannibalism from desperate survival into sacred communion. She preached that consuming the flesh of the spiritually contaminated allowed the righteous to absorb and neutralize their sins, preventing the spread of corruption throughout the community. This doctrine justified not only murder, but the careful preparation and distribution of human remains as sacred elements in monthly covenant meals that bound the entire settlement in shared guilt. Young Samuel, barely 14 when Crawford disappeared, showed the most disturbing aptitude for the family's dark calling. While his older siblings managed the logistics of murder, Samuel displayed an intuitive understanding of psychological manipulation that allowed him to identify potential victims weeks before formal accusations began. He possessed his father's charisma without the pretense of moral struggle, embracing evil with the pure enthusiasm of youth, uncorrupted by conscience or doubt. Samuel's specialty was recruiting children into the family's inner circle through a combination of bribery, threats, and careful grooming that normalized violence as divine service. He organized youth activities that included mock trials and punishment ceremonies, teaching the settlement's children to view suffering as necessary purification and to report suspicious behavior among their own families. By 1865, Samuel commanded a network of juvenile informants who provided detailed intelligence about every household in Redemption Hollow. The underground chambers beneath the church expanded during this period, creating a labyrinth of purification rooms designed for different types of spiritual cleansing. Some chambers contained only shackles and drainage channels for traditional interrogation and execution. Others held more specialized equipment for extracting confessions or prolonging suffering in the name of thorough soul cleansing. The newest additions included preparation facilities where human remains were processed for consumption, equipped with cutting tables, preservation equipment, and cooking facilities that would have impressed professional butchers. But it was the Covenant chamber that revealed the full extent of Redemption Hollow's corruption. Here, the Sinclairs practiced their most blasphemous innovation: the transformation of murder victims into communion elements for their monthly covenant meals. What began as symbolic cannibalism evolved into literal consumption, justified by twisted interpretations of Christ's sacrifice and the need for complete spiritual unity among the faithful. The monthly covenant meals became elaborate ceremonies that combined religious ritual with community feast. Jeremiah would begin with sermons explaining the theological necessity of consuming sin through the flesh of the contaminated, while Ruth supervised the preparation of sacred elements in the underground kitchens. Rebecca led prayers of gratitude for the souls whose sacrifice enabled the community's purification, and Samuel organized the younger participants to ensure their enthusiastic participation. The territorial authorities received occasional reports about missing persons in the Redemption Hollow area, but these investigations invariably concluded with the same findings. People moved frequently in frontier Arizona, record-keeping was poor, and Apache raids accounted for many disappearances. The Sinclairs' careful documentation of each victim's departure and their generous contributions to territorial officials ensured that deeper inquiries were politely discouraged. By 1870, Redemption Hollow had achieved an equilibrium of terror that satisfied both the Sinclairs' appetites and the community's need for survival. The settlement prospered economically. Its population remained stable through carefully managed recruitment, and its reputation as a model Christian community attracted positive attention from territorial officials who valued any success story in the challenging Arizona frontier. By 1876, Redemption Hollow had achieved a reputation throughout Arizona Territory as a model Christian community where crime was unknown and prosperity blessed the righteous. Travelers praised the settlement's hospitality and the Sinclair family's charitable work among struggling pioneers. What they didn't realize was that this paradise had been built on a foundation of carefully concealed bones and sustained by the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened its dark equilibrium. The catalyst for change arrived in the form of Margaret Riley, a 24-year-old schoolteacher from Boston whose Eastern education and independent spirit marked her as dangerous from the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. Margaret had come west following her fiancé's death in Dazitadiu, a mining accident, seeking to rebuild her life through service to frontier children. Her references were impeccable, her demeanor modest and devout, and her savings sufficient to make her self-sufficient. qualities that made her both valuable and threatening to the Sinclair hierarchy. Jeremiah, now 53 and bearing the bloated confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions, initially viewed Margaret as an opportunity rather than a threat. Her Eastern refinement and educational credentials would enhance Redemption Hollow's reputation, while her obvious vulnerability as a single woman in dangerous territory would ensure her dependence on his protection. What he failed to recognize was the steel beneath her proper Victorian exterior and the analytical mind hidden behind her gentle demeanor. Margaret's first weeks in Redemption Hollow passed without incident. She established her school in the church's upper room, taught reading and arithmetic to 37 children, and attended Sunday services with appropriate reverence. But her training in rational inquiry and her natural empathy for suffering made her notice discrepancies that long-time residents had learned to ignore. The children spoke of missing playmates with a matter-of-fact acceptance that chilled her. When she asked about the Morrison boy, who'd apparently vanished the previous spring, her students explained that he'd been called home to Jesus during a special purification ceremony. Similar explanations accounted for the absence of other children, always following some period of behavioral problems or family difficulties. More disturbing were the subtle signs of malnutrition and psychological trauma among her students. Despite Redemption Hollow's apparent prosperity, many children bore the hollow-eyed look of chronic hunger. They flinched at sudden movements, spoke in whispers even during recreational activities, and displayed an unnatural fear of authority figures. Several bore poorly healed injuries that suggested systematic abuse disguised as religious discipline. Margaret's methodical mind began cataloging these observations in a private journal, initially intending to document the challenges of frontier education for potential publication. But as patterns emerged, her academic exercise transformed into criminal investigation. The monthly covenant meals that followed each new moon. The families that vanished completely, leaving behind only explanations of urgent departures. The underground chambers that children mentioned in frightened whispers before being silenced by older siblings. Her first direct confrontation with the settlement's true nature came during her third month in Redemption Hollow, when the Hendricks family disappeared overnight. John Hendricks had questioned Jeremiah's interpretation of Scripture during a Sunday service, suggesting that Christ's message emphasized forgiveness rather than punishment. The theological debate continued after service, with Hendricks citing chapter and verse to support his position, while Jeremiah's responses grew increasingly heated. 3 days later, neighbors found the Hendricks homestead abandoned, with signs of hasty departure but no indication of their destination. Jeremiah announced that the family had received urgent word of inheritance opportunities in California and departed immediately to avoid losing their claim. Their property, naturally, would be held in trust by the church until their return. Margaret knew the Hendricks family personally. She taught their 3 children and had taken Sunday dinner with them just days before their departure. She also knew that John Hendricks had recently broken his leg in a farming accident and could barely walk, let alone undertake a journey to California. When she expressed these concerns to other community members, she was met with nervous silence or gentle suggestions that Eastern ladies sometimes misunderstood frontier realities. Margaret's investigation might have ended with cautious speculation, if not for the discovery that transformed her from curious observer to desperate fugitive. While organizing her classroom after a particularly difficult day with increasingly frightened students, she knocked over a loose floorboard that revealed a child-sized hiding space beneath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden with the desperate care of someone expecting death, was a journal belonging to 12-year-old Billy Morrison, the boy whose disappearance her students had explained with such disturbing acceptance. Billy's journal chronicled his growing awareness of Redemption Hollow's true nature with the brutal honesty that only children possess. He'd witnessed his father's trial through a crack in the church floor, watching as Marcus Sinclair read charges of adultery based on evidence that Billy knew was fabricated. He'd seen his mother dragged to the purification chambers and heard her screams for 3 nights before the sounds stopped forever. Most horrifically, he'd watched through his bedroom window as figures moved between the church and cemetery in the dark hours before dawn, carrying bundles that were too large to be supplies and too carefully handled to be anything but human remains. The journal's final entries described Billy's growing realization that his own turn was approaching. Jeremiah had begun asking pointed questions about his spiritual development and his willingness to honor his parents' sacrifice through total obedience. Other children had reported Billy's reluctance to participate in certain church activities, marking him as potentially contaminated by his parents' sins. His last entry, dated the night before his disappearance, contained a desperate plea. "If someone finds this, know that we didn't leave. We were taken. And if you're smart, you'll run before they take you too." Margaret's hands trembled as she read Billy's account of the covenant meals, described with the clinical precision of a child trying to understand adult horrors. The monthly gatherings weren't metaphorical communion, but literal consumption of previous victims, justified by sermons that transformed cannibalism into sacred ritual. The bread served at these ceremonies came from the preparation chamber, where human flesh was processed with the same care other churches applied to wine and wafers. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Redemption Hollow intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Margaret's terrifying discovery. Armed with Billy's testimony, Margaret began planning her escape from Redemption Hollow, but she soon discovered that leaving the settlement was far more difficult than entering it. The Sinclairs maintained careful watch over potential departures, requiring advance notice and acceptable justification for any travel plans. Those who attempted to leave without permission were invariably brought back for community consultation about their spiritual welfare. Margaret's situation became more precarious when Ruth Sinclair approached her with an invitation to join the inner circle of church ladies who assisted with special ceremonies. The invitation was presented as an honor, but Margaret recognized it as a test. Her acceptance would grant her access to the full truth about Redemption Hollow's practices, but it would also make her complicit in murders she couldn't prevent or escape. The October Covenant meal approached like an execution date. Margaret knew she had perhaps days before her refusal to participate marked her as spiritually contaminated and therefore eligible for purification. Her desperate search for escape routes led her to explore the settlement's outer boundaries, where she made a discovery that revealed the true scope of the Sinclairs' crimes. Hidden in a box canyon 3 miles from town, Margaret found what could only be described as a charnel house disguised as a sacred grove. Dozens of skulls lined carefully constructed stone shelves, each bearing carved inscriptions that included names, dates, and spiritual assessments. The remains showed signs of careful preparation, bones cleaned and sorted, some showing knife marks consistent with deliberate dismemberment. But it was the central altar that revealed the industrial scale of Redemption Hollow's cannibalistic practices. The stone surface bore permanent stains and permanent fixtures designed to facilitate the efficient processing of human remains. Channels directed fluids to collection vessels, while specialized tools lay arranged with the precision of a surgeon's instruments. This wasn't the site of occasional ritual murder, but of systematic human harvest, conducted with businesslike efficiency. Margaret's final night in Redemption Hollow began with the sound of approaching footsteps and the certain knowledge that her investigation had been discovered. Through her cabin window, she could see torches moving through the settlement like hunting wolves, while Jeremiah's voice echoed from the church bell tower. calling the faithful to participate in an emergency purification ceremony. The target of their spiritual attention wasn't mentioned by name, but Margaret knew she was the evening sacrifice to their perverted vision of divine justice. The confrontation that would either save Margaret Riley or add her name to the wooden communion table began at midnight on October 30th, 1876, when the last rational soul in Redemption Hollow barricaded herself in the schoolhouse and waited for the inevitable assault. Through the windows, she could see the entire settlement moving with the coordinated precision of a predatory pack, their torches creating a ring of light that gradually contracted around her refuge like a noose tightening around condemned flesh. Jeremiah's voice boomed across the settlement, no longer bothering with the pretense of reasonable discourse. The mask of benevolent spiritual authority had fallen away completely, revealing the megalomaniacal cannibal who had spent decades justifying murder as divine service. Sister Riley, your pride has poisoned this holy community for too long. But our merciful God offers redemption even to the most corrupted souls. Come forth willingly, and your purification will be swift. Resist, and we shall be forced to extract the contamination slowly, as befits such stubborn sin. Margaret had used her final hours of freedom to document everything she'd learned about the Sinclair family's crimes, creating multiple copies of Billy Morrison's journal and her own observations. She'd hidden these documents throughout the schoolhouse and buried additional copies in locations around the settlement, hoping that if she couldn't escape to carry the truth beyond Redemption Hollow's borders, perhaps evidence would survive to expose the horror when outsiders eventually investigated her disappearance. Her response to Jeremiah's ultimatum echoed through the settlement with the clear diction of a trained educator, addressing particularly stubborn students. I know what you are, Jeremiah Sinclair. I know about the 37 souls whose names are carved in your chamber of horrors. I know about Billy Morrison, the Hendricks family, Thomas Crawford, and all the others you've murdered and consumed in your blasphemous ceremonies. And I know that God's true judgment awaits you. Not in your perverted rituals, but in the eternal damnation reserved for those who corrupt His word to justify their cannibalistic appetites. The attack began with false offers of mercy and escalated to threats of communal punishment. Marcus Sinclair announced through a speaking trumpet that Margaret's refusal to submit was endangering the spiritual welfare of the entire settlement, particularly the children under her care. If she continued to resist, the purification ceremony would expand to include any students who might have been contaminated by her Eastern corruptions and rebellious questioning of established spiritual authority. You hear that, Miss Riley? Samuel Sinclair's young voice carried a chilling enthusiasm that made his threats even more disturbing. Little Emma Patterson is standing right here beside me, and she's crying because she's afraid you've made her soul dirty with your wicked thoughts. Don't you think she deserves to be cleaned properly? We could start with her if you prefer. Children purify so much faster than stubborn adults. This threat broke Margaret's resolve to remain passive. She'd spent 3 months watching the systematic destruction of innocence in Redemption Hollow, documenting crimes that would horrify civilized society while feeling powerless to prevent them. But the prospect of children suffering for her defiance transformed fear into fury. And she decided that if death was inevitable, she would at least force the Sinclairs to reveal their true nature before witnesses who might survive to testify. Margaret's reply cut through the night air like a blade of righteous judgment. You want to talk about contamination, Jeremiah? Let's discuss the real source of corruption in this settlement. Tell your followers about Missouri. Tell them about the church members you butchered during that blizzard. Tell them about your father's first taste of human flesh and how it awakened, an appetite that's been growing ever since. Tell them how you've convinced them to become cannibals by calling murder purification and cannibalism communion. The theological challenge struck Jeremiah like a physical blow, not because it threatened his power, but because it exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his delusion. For nearly 30 years, he'd convinced himself that cannibalistic murder represented divine service, that consuming the flesh of the innocent purified his own corrupted soul. Margaret's words forced him to confront the possibility that his entire adult life had been dedicated to serving evil while believing he served God. His response revealed the madness that lurked beneath his charismatic exterior, the complete moral inversion that allowed him to see murder as mercy and cannibalism as communion. "You dare invoke God's name, you Eastern whore. You who would corrupt our children with your godless education and your questions that undermine faith. We are the chosen instruments of divine justice, purifying this land of contamination that threatens the righteous. Our covenant meals sanctify us as Christ's blood sanctified his disciples. We consume sin itself, taking the corruption of others into ourselves so that this community might remain pure in God's sight." Margaret's final reply carried the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You consume human flesh because you enjoy murder, Jeremiah. Everything else is just the lie you tell yourself to sleep at night. But I wonder, do you really sleep? Or do you lie awake, hearing the screams of 37 innocent souls demanding justice from a God who sees everything you've done?" The assault on the schoolhouse began with systematic destruction rather than direct attack. The Sinclairs had learned that gradual psychological pressure often broke resistance more effectively than immediate violence, and they wanted Margaret alive and cooperative for the special purification ceremony they'd planned. They set fire to Margaret's personal belongings outside the windows, destroyed the school supplies she'd brought from Boston, and began killing livestock within her sight, while describing in explicit detail what they planned to do to her body once she surrendered. Ruth Sinclair's voice joined the psychological torture with the cold precision of an accountant calculating assets. "We've already prepared the purification chamber for you, Margaret. The restraints are sized specifically for your delicate Eastern frame, and we've sharpened the knives to ensure clean cuts. Your meat will feed this community for weeks, and your bones will join the others in our sacred grove. Your sacrifice will nourish the righteous and cleanse your corrupted soul." But Margaret had spent her final hours preparing more than written testimony. Her Eastern education included practical skills that frontier communities rarely expected in refined ladies, including knowledge of chemistry acquired through her father's medical practice. The lamp oil and cleaning supplies in the schoolhouse, combined with materials from her science demonstration kit, provided everything needed to create weapons more dangerous than anything the Sinclairs expected from a Boston schoolteacher. The explosion that shattered the October night transformed Redemption Hollow's careful choreography of terror into chaos. Margaret's improvised bomb destroyed the church's bell tower and set fire to the wooden sections of the main building, while the sound of the blast carried for miles across the desert, alerting distant settlements that something catastrophic had occurred in their peaceful neighbor community. In the confusion of flame and smoke, Margaret escaped through a basement window she'd prepared earlier, carrying her documentation and heading for the hidden canyon, where she knew territorial authorities would eventually find evidence of the Sinclair's crimes. The gunshot that caught her in the shoulder came from Samuel Sinclair, who'd anticipated her escape route with the intuitive cunning that made him the most dangerous member of his family. But the wound wasn't enough to stop her desperate flight toward the evidence cache that would expose Redemption Hollow's secrets to the outside world. The territorial marshal who arrived 3 days later found Redemption Hollow in a state of organized abandonment rather than destroyed chaos. Marshal William Hayes, no relation to the settlement's deacon of the same name, had been summoned by reports of explosions and fires visible from neighboring communities. But what he discovered challenged his 20 years of experience in territorial law enforcement. Most of the settlement's buildings remained intact, but the population had vanished as completely as the families the Sinclairs had systematically murdered over 3 decades. Only Margaret Riley remained, found unconscious near the schoolhouse, with severe burns and a bullet wound that had barely missed her heart. Her survival was miraculous, but her testimony was initially dismissed as delirium brought on by trauma and blood loss. The story she told of systematic cannibalism disguised as religious ceremony, of underground chambers designed for torture and murder, of an entire community complicit in decades of ritualized consumption of human flesh, seemed too horrific for rational consideration. But Margaret's detailed documentation, hidden throughout the settlement and in the canyon charnel house, provided physical evidence that corroborated her account with disturbing precision. The underground chambers contained not only torture equipment and murder weapons, but also meticulous records documenting 37 confirmed killings over a span of 18 years. The Sinclairs had maintained ledgers tracking each victim's spiritual contamination, purification requirements, and ultimate disposition with the cold precision of a slaughterhouse accounting system. Marshal Hayes's investigation revealed organizational sophistication that exceeded anything in his experience with frontier crime. The Sinclairs had maintained detailed correspondence with other isolated religious communities throughout the Western Territories, suggesting that Redemption Hollow might not have been unique in its practices. Letters found in Jeremiah's study referenced purification techniques and covenant meal preparations in language that suggested similar activities in remote settlements across Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California. The charnel house, beyond the settlement, yielded physical evidence that left no room for skepticism about Margaret's account. Forensic examination of the remains revealed systematic dismemberment, consistent with preparation for consumption, while chemical analysis of stains on the altar confirmed the presence of human blood and tissue from multiple individuals. Most disturbing were the careful inscriptions on each skull, revealing that the Sinclairs had assigned spiritual grades to their victims based on the quality of their flesh and the completeness of their purification. Dr. Charles Morrison, the territorial physician who examined the remains, wrote in his official report, "The level of anatomical knowledge displayed in the preparation of these remains suggests medical training or extensive practice in human dissection. The cuts are precise, the bone separation clean, and the preservation methods indicate familiarity with techniques used in both medical schools and commercial meat processing. This was not the work of deranged amateurs, but of individuals who had perfected their methods through years of systematic practice." But the true horror of Redemption Hollow lay not in the physical evidence of murder and cannibalism, but in the psychological documentation the Sinclairs had maintained. Their private journals revealed the gradual transformation of a struggling frontier preacher into a cannibalistic cult leader, tracking Jeremiah's descent from biblical literalism through theological innovation to complete moral inversion. Each entry showed him becoming more convinced that his crimes represented divine service, that consuming human flesh purified his soul and protected his community from spiritual contamination. Rebecca Sinclair's theological writings were particularly disturbing, containing detailed justifications for cannibalism that drew from ancient pagan traditions, medieval heretical texts, and twisted interpretations of Christian communion. Her work revealed extensive research into historical precedents for ritualized cannibalism, suggesting that the Sinclairs had deliberately sought out and adapted practices from cultures that viewed human consumption as sacred duty rather than criminal act. The fate of the Sinclair family themselves remained one of the investigation's most troubling mysteries. Despite extensive searches throughout Arizona Territory and neighboring regions, none of the primary conspirators were ever located or identified among the dead. Some investigators believed they died in the schoolhouse explosion and resulting fires, their bodies consumed in the conflagration they'd helped create. Others suggested they'd escaped to Mexico or California under assumed identities, possibly joining other isolated communities where their practices could continue without interference. The most disturbing theory, supported by Margaret's testimony about their final conversations and the correspondence found in their papers, was that they'd retreated deeper into the desert to establish a new settlement where their practices could continue without the complications of territorial oversight. Several reports from Apache scouts described abandoned mining camps that showed signs of recent occupation and disturbing modifications to existing structures, including underground chambers similar to those found in Redemption Hollow. Marshal Hayes tracked these leads for months, but the vastness of the territory and the Sinclair's apparent skill at concealment made capture impossible. His final report concluded, "The Sinclair family has demonstrated an ability to establish and maintain a criminal enterprise of unprecedented sophistication and horror. Their escape suggests advanced planning and resources that exceed typical frontier capabilities. All territorial authorities should be alert for similar patterns of settlement establishment, community isolation, and suspicious disappearances that might indicate the re-establishment of their practices elsewhere." Margaret Riley survived her injuries, but never fully recovered from her experiences in Redemption Hollow. The physical wounds healed within months, but the psychological trauma of witnessing systematic cannibalism disguised as religious worship haunted her for the remainder of her life. She returned to Boston, where she spent decades working with charitable organizations dedicated to protecting children from religious abuse and helping law enforcement agencies recognize the warning signs of cultic manipulation. Her detailed account of the Sinclair family's crimes became a confidential document within territorial and later federal law enforcement, cited in training materials about cult behavior and used to identify similar patterns in other isolated communities. The case file remained classified for over 50 years, released only after researchers studying religious extremism in the American West petitioned for access to historical documents that might help understand the psychological mechanisms that enable systematic atrocity within religious communities. The settlement of Redemption Hollow was officially disbanded, its buildings left to decay in the desert heat, while its land was declared unsuitable for development. Local Apache tribes, who had always avoided the area claiming it was haunted by angry spirits, continued to warn travelers away from the abandoned buildings. Their oral traditions, passed down through generations, spoke of white settlers who had offended the natural order by consuming their own kind and whose corruption lingered in the very soil. Several attempts were made over the following decades to resettle the area, but none succeeded for more than a few months. Families reported persistent nightmares, children refused to sleep alone, and livestock exhibited unusual behavior that suggested ongoing environmental contamination. By 1890, even the most desperate homesteaders avoided the region, and territorial maps began omitting Redemption Hollow from official surveys. This mystery shows us how isolation and absolute power can transform faith into fanaticism and sanctuary into slaughterhouse. The Sinclair family's crimes weren't the result of sudden madness, but of gradual moral corruption, justified by increasingly twisted interpretations of divine will. Their ability to maintain their practices for decades while presenting a facade of Christian respectability demonstrates the dangerous potential of religious authority when combined with geographical isolation and community dependence. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in the Arizona desert? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video. Modern investigators have occasionally attempted to locate the ruins of Redemption Hollow, drawn by Margaret Riley's detailed geographical descriptions and the prospect of uncovering additional evidence about the Sinclair crimes. But the desert has a way of reclaiming abandoned places, and shifting sands have buried most traces of the settlement beneath decades of accumulated silence. Perhaps it's better that way. Some secrets are too dangerous to disturb, and some hungers are too terrible to risk awakening again.